The Yemen crisis is the largest humanitarian crisis in the world at this moment, with around 21 million, three-quarters of the population, including 11 million children, in dire need of humanitarian assistance. The conflict has manifested itself in an ongoing civil war, with contested leadership from both those loyal to President Hadi and those loyal to the previous president, Ali Abdel Saleh, in conjunction with the anti-Hadi Houthi rebels, who were overthrown following the global Arab Spring upswing, a global campaign to depose corrupt leaders in the Arab world, which hit Yemen in 2011. Both sides of the conflict are also actively funded by both Saudi Arabia, who supports the Yemeni security forces, and Iran, who supported the Houthi rebels, respectively based on religious Sunni-Shia alliances, essentially turning the conflict into a proxy war for influence and for control of the important stretch outside of the Suez Canal, which borders Yemen. Overall, the conflict between the Houthis has been blurred, the number of players and interests involved. The initial conflict began when the Houthi rebels took over the capital, Sana'a, in 2014, resulting in attempts to restore Hadi, a president from both the Saudis and security forces not loyal to the former leader. Overall, the conflict has split into an all-out civil, with new players on the global terrorist front, such as Al-Qaeda, becoming involved in the conflict along with original forces and interests. The crisis has resulted in a total loss of food security, as well as rampant malnourishment. This has put Yemen on the brink of famine, with 5 million in direct threat of starvation. The state has also been subject to a major cholera outbreak, with no clear line of entrance for health and humanitarian workers to intervene, resulting in the deaths of thousands in Yemen, from a disease that, with sufficient supplies, is easily treated. Large amounts of civilians have also been killed, maimed, tortured, and raped through the attempted insurgency, as Yemen has been flung into a perpetual state of chaos since the start of the civil war since late 2014. Of all those who have been severely affected by the conflict, unfortunately children have been the largest victims, with a projected 400,000 expected to die without urgent treatment. Terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda have also gotten involved with the conflict, continuing their perpetration against the Yemeni population, with common, often undetected, gross human injustices and breaches of human rights. The Saudi-led coalition to restore Hadi has also a crisis for civilians, with strings of air attacks on so-called enemies, often killing hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians through this campaign. Different views towards who should be in the primary position of power have been affected by not only those groups who inhabit Yemen, but also those with interest in the region, with its positioning alongside the exit of the Suez Canal. Overall, the different positions on the issue have been exacerbated by the different interests of those who have flung the conflict into a proxy war, with that being the current government backed by Saudi Arabia and its allies, namely the United States, and with the insurgents backed by Iran. Both nations with their own unique spheres of influence around the Arabian Peninsula and their own individual interests not only fund the conflict out of the national interest, but also out of religious interests, with both sides of the conflict being Sunni and Shia Muslims respectively, with this conflict not being the first along religious lines backed by both forces in the Middle East. The Shia minority, the Houthis, feel as though they have been marginalized by the large Sunni population and government, resulting in the capturing of the capital in 2014, growing divisions along sect lines, with the long ongoing conflict widening the gap between both sides, making a change to a shared peace a difficult goal for both. The main obstacle to change is the fact that, due to the scale of the ongoing conflict, incentives are not often aligned. Both sides of the conflict believe that if the other rises on top, that they will be persecuted as a group by a tyrannical dictator with an unending term. Houthis have also been accused of blocking or stealing aid for civilians. Both sides also believe that they have a right to power, with both groups having almost endless military support from those who place specific interests in both groups. Essentially, the war is on two fronts. The first being that of Sunnis and Shias, with loyalties to the either, and the deposed former leaders in conjunction with the Houthi rebels, or the current leader in conjunction who previously fled the capital due to the Houthi insurgency. Both groups want direct rule, and both are unlikely to budge. On the second level, the conflict between the Saudi Arabia and Iran presents its own unique obstacles, namely the fact of deep political alliances based on military and financial incentives, and due to the development of an indirect conflict between the two states manifesting itself closely contested proxy wars. In essence, the main challenge to the control is based on the wide array of different incentives, from money to influence to control, and because these do not often align for both sides of the conflict, and when they do, they do not often offer the same levels of return to those involved. Change in this area is paramount as the conflict has resulted in the largest humanitarian crisis on Earth, backed by the main allies as some of the most powerful forces on Earth, with the largest victims being civilians. The conflict also has the possibility of changing from a proxy war between the Saudis and Iran into a hot conflict between both sides, which along with alliances would mean the bloodiest war in the Middle East. Not only of the past decade, but of the past 1,000 years. The crisis has also caused the largest human rights violations in recent history, with millions being the victims of abuse. The crisis also has no end in sight without intervention, therefore suggesting the need to change primary focus towards the Yemen crisis. As with any unending war, the only solution is diplomacy. A deal must be brokered between both sides of the conflict, without the influence from the states who projected the conflict as a proxy war. It is therefore necessary to stop the active campaign against the Houthi rebels from the Saudis, and a position of defense along the northern border must be reached, rather than its current offensive position. Arms to Yemen must be cut, this being done with a necessary threat of economic tariffs against both Iran and Saudi Arabia. This will end the bombing campaign, killing thousands of civilians, and open the north for UN aid. For there to be UN aid coming into Yemen, UN aid must be supplied, and therefore we need to ramp up humanitarian efforts into Yemen for both medical and nutritional aid. Simultaneously, the UN must also brokerage the possibility of a split in Yemen, a split into primarily Sunni and primarily Shia territories, with a semi-porous border allowing for refugees to safely cross between both sides, fearing prosecution from the new majorities. The conflict therefore requires UN military assistance to protect the possibility of invasion from one side to another. In essence, none of these outcomes cannot be met without sufficient fundings for talks between both sides, for humanitarian aid, and for defense along the lines of Sunni and Shia populations. The objective is clear. First, to set up talks between both forces. The second step is to establish temporary territories to limit conflict, and to pave the way for the possibility of reunification in the future. And third, possibly simultaneous action, is to send in much needed aid to civilians, those hit most hard by the conflict. It must be stressed that although a permanent political solution may not be initially possible, it is necessary that the conflict must stop, and that the humanitarian aid arrives at those worst affected, and that the possibility of a future stable political order is only possible after the all-out civil war is put to halt, with the necessary ceasefire and negotiations that this entails. A resource required for this project is funding. Funding for the UN via international donations, as well as enough money to provide the resources for enabling these talks between the two sides, UN military assistance, and donations of nutritional resources for the suffering and starving. There would need to be massive social media influence to gain attention for the crisis, being able to gain celebrity recognition, example for Angelina Jolie. Good attention from the public would mean more donations and more steps forward to solving the world's biggest humanitarian crisis. These actions are required to be able to solve the crisis in Yemen, together with funding, military equipment, donations, international support, and worldwide recognition. Peace might be able to be achieved. By solving the Yemen crisis, we are not only bringing about peace, but change. Change in more than 21 million people's lives. For the first time in some of these people's lives, they will be able to go to school or eat a proper meal. They would know the feeling of not being hungry or being able to sleep knowing that they would wake up safe with their family the next morning. They would have access to healthcare, water, and electricity. A change in Yemen that I believe is possible within the means of the world would benefit generations and generations to come. With your support, we would be able to solve the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, that is Yemen.